I think one thing that might be really interesting for everyone in the audience, and it's interesting for me, I think, too, and I know for these guys, to make some kind of connection between this app dev world we've spent the whole morning and the early afternoon talking about, and enterprise applications that we all know that are in widespread use in lots and lots of companies. And I think for a lot of people in the audience who are both building these applications and looking at investing in this space, one thing that might be interesting to hear a little bit more about is, what are the connections, what are the integration points, what are the developers inside enterprises need to do to take advantage of these distributed applications. And I know one of my colleagues has written just a story in this week's issue of Business Week about this very subject, so it's kind of timely. But I want to start by asking you, I know we talked about this a little bit this morning, maybe each of you, what do we actually mean by a decentralized application? Does it mean some kind of distributed computing? Does it mean anything that's built on a blockchain? Does it mean services that don't have to incorporate Google or Facebook or Amazon? How do you guys define it? Do you want to maybe start, Rouven?
Sure. I think when you mentioned like distributed computing is something which is more the foundation. So what happens now with platforms like Ethereum, you have now obviously a blockchain as like the data layer, and the processing is something done with Ethereum, so you can now run decentralized applications on top of them. And that's kind of the foundation where applications like the DAO, which we discussed this morning, is something which can happen now, where you don't have anyone required to run it or stop it.
So let's just be clear. So your company is ConsenSys,
yes.
And you're an investment company, though you're not a partnership, but you're investing in companies that build mainly on top of the Ethereum environment.
So we are like a venture studio. So what we do is we have 35 different projects. They are at different stages. So sometimes really small ideas where we have one developer working on some ideas, and in some cases it's already like products. And ultimately we want to bring them to be companies. And we have 2 companies where we work with, which are already like now at a stage that they take external investments. And we are like mainly focused on building decentralized applications on Ethereum.
Any other definitions of what we mean by decentralized or distributed?
Sure. I think that decentralized applications, particularly in the ecosystem space, or sorry, in the enterprise space, is a little bit of a misnomer. I typically talk about ecosystem applications, and I think that is a little bit better, particularly when you're talking about the enterprise space. I think it's a little bit better nomenclature, because really what we're talking about is moving data layer, the data layer as well as the processing layer up so it runs consistently across a number of actors within an ecosystem. So for me, that's what I don't typically use the term decentralized applications because I don't actually know what those mean.
Okay, so your company is called ERIS, and you're building this this development environment, this platform, you would call it. Banking is one of the industries you're targeting. You said you don't like to use the word decentralized, but what's the problem you're trying to solve for these enterprise clients then?
Sure. So typically what we see in the information age is that companies are becoming much more networked, and they have massive reconciliation challenges around what their data is, around what the outcome of certain actions taken within a network or ecosystem are. And that's the core problem that we're solving for folks.
And you know a little bit about this because you're a lawyer also, is that right? Or?
I am a lawyer, yes. Okay. So this is one of the real keys for us is being able to deploy these systems within highly regulated industries in a legally compliant way.
You have a different perspective, right, Yann? You're investing in this as a VC.
Yeah, so out of disclosure, we are investors in ERIS. We've invested in them in 2014 when they were doing DOG, which was one of the first DAOs, I believe, which was a replacement for the Bitcoin Foundation. So we're going back to DAOs, but we're taking a convoluted curve and travel there, which I think reflects a bit the maturity of the space. Well, the way we see it is basically you either have network of humans or network of companies, and you look at the global economy is basically a network of companies, and even if you look at a company itself, it's a network of functions. And we look a lot at the theory of the firm, which says that, the limits of the company are defined by the transaction cost. And the way we see a decentralized application is the support to change those limits and kind of, have the transaction cost of coordination allow for more distributed plays. So, but look at the reason financial markets are a good start and people are attracted is by definition it's a multi-party transactions world. There is no bilateral agreement, there is multilateral agreement, these people need to work and collaborate together, funds flow across people, funds flow across companies, and that's what makes it, you know, a good place to start. This is replacing vertical platforms, own platforms, so typically Visa as an example in payment versus, you know, shared platforms across the players who actually play an economic role around the payment system.
So you're trying to disrupt a little bit on the transaction side, or?
Yeah, I think transaction in the broadest sense of transaction is effectively we're trying to find ways for having an efficient way for multiple parties of various size to transact together.
So we've heard from a lot of startups during the day. What about actually building these kind of applications in enterprise environments? I mean, that's a different ballgame, right? And you know, my colleague Olga Karif, who has written extensively about this actually for Business Week, just in this week's issue, wrote about a number of examples. You know, there's a banking consortium called R3 that includes quite a few big names, right? JP Morgan Chase, Barclays, Wells, your old bank, Deutsche. What are they doing, for example?
Yeah, before I started at ConsenSys, I worked at Deutsche Bank, and I was actually their representative from Deutsche Bank to R3. So at that time, end of last year, they brought in the 40x banks together. And it's really like, I think, to get the industry together to get on the same page in terms of the language, talk about the same use cases. So they look into what are, I think, the first real cases they can explore. They looked into some of the platforms, invited some of the industry players like ERIS and others into that, and started with experiments. So it's really, I think, to get the industry together, because the benefit, especially for banking, is to make it more efficient. I think there's a lot of processes, as Casey mentioned, which are broken, and I think to replace this is ideal if you can do this with the industry. So if other people can use the same system, it's much more efficient than if you fix or build a blockchain in yourself. Like for
Wait, so what are the banks trying to solve here? I mean, they can reconcile transactions today, right?
The reality of that is slightly different. I think it's the more people work on the back end of banks, the more I guess they're surprised that the numbers are right on their bank accounts in general, because it's still a very manual process. And if you're reconciling transaction, it happens that someone fat fingers the stuff and sends them 50 billion instead of saying 50 million. And so you have two transactions with different amounts, and they get reconciled, and people try to settle this, and it takes 5 days, and the money is late, and you pay interest. And that's the reality of the back end of banking. It's not, I mean, the Bloomberg terminal is shiny and nice, old, but shiny and nice, but the reality of the processing on the back of it is much more manual and different. And so I think that's a massive opportunity, really.
One of the things that we can see within sort of the consumer end of this is that, and I think the DAO demonstrates this a little bit, is that the DAO starts with the economics and is working its way to the government, to the governance. If you're in a highly regulated industry, you can't really start at the economics and work your way to the governance. You actually have to start at the governance. And one of the things that is beneficial about a number of consortium that are forming, so you have a range of consortium that are jurisdictional focused or are global focused. R3 is one of the many that we know that exist, is they provide a forum to start talking about the governance issues from the get-go about how we would go about really building these ecosystem applications.
What are some of the other industry consortia that are worth mentioning here?
Well, mostly all the consortium that we know of are within pure finance, but there are others that are more jurisdictional focused. So you have one in London, you have one in Paris, there's a number that are around.
So what's the hardest thing, though, about building these type of applications in an enterprise environment? Is it marshaling the developer talent? Is it getting the developers trained? Is it meeting regulatory requirements? Do you want to start?
So I think the reality, and that's, you know, the panel was around application. I think the reality of this is we still lack talents. As the main constraint on building decentralized application today is the lack of development talent, which is increasing because with people, ERIS, ConsenSys, I mean, a lot of that is education, a lot of that is, you know, but if you look at the banks, and you probably know that, there is, you know, you come in, you do a prototype, you train 5 to 10 developers, but that's 5 to 10 developers is 0.0% of the actual developer pool of the bank. And so and that gets solved two ways. One way is increasing talent, and those conferences are helpful for that, and getting more and more people to play with the software. The other way is to abstract the complexity in the tools. And so I think that's what, I'm going to play my book. This is what we're looking with ERIS. This is what we're looking with ConsenSys as well. It's really, how do we keep the value of decentralized application, but we create an abstraction for that developers don't have such a step to make to be able to code applications, that they don't have to relearn everything, and they can use some of their basic learnings to be able to develop applications.
What's your view, Rouven?
Yeah, I think, as you mentioned, it's really early stage. I think some of the products and some of the tools which are out there are still not, great yet. I think there's a lot of happened over the last 12 months already to make it easier for people to adopt it. I think once we are there, that key management, identity aspects are solved. Once we have solved some of the, privacy aspects, which is still a question if you have consortiums, even the fact that you can see data across this, it's already, there's a lot of questions, and I think the industry is working on many of these interesting solutions. It is partly the educational part, but I think once we have achieved that the tools itself can work, and we have the translation from contracts into code, then it's actually super efficient, and I think that's where it's super interesting. I think the DAO has 150 lines of code, so once we are there, it will be actually quite attractive.
Wait, I want to come back to the abstraction and the developer story, but just stay on the privacy issue for a minute. What is the risk in these consortia?
So I think in general, yes, you can say you can make a private one, then you're the only one who sees this. But once you are interacting, even if the 43 banks will set up all a node, and they say only between them, even the fact that I can see what two other entities are transferring between them might already give me data which is more than I want to reveal. What's the price of their trading between each other? So there's a lot of questions which even in a consortium are not as easy to solve.
What are the experience of your enterprise customers? What are the biggest roadblocks to getting these things implemented or even proof of concepted?
I think there's two. I agree fully with Rouven that right now for most of our users, privacy is the biggest challenge. There's workarounds and there's ways to do this now, which sort of leads to the second biggest challenge, which is really internalizing this. So most large enterprises are used to going to a technology provider and being able to buy your solution off the shelf. And that will solve an existing business need that they have. However, to the extent that probably the folks in this room generally are in the vicinity of 10% right, this is going to cause such massive shifts in the way that businesses and consumers interact with each other that there is going to be a need to internalize what is actually happening here rather than just going to a tech provider and buying something off the shelf that is going to solve all their needs.
So let's talk about off the shelf though, right? Because this is one of the themes, and you even mentioned it yourself, Yann, right? How do you abstract this away enough that developers can comfortably use it? I mean, there are steps in this direction, right? Microsoft has shipped some of this capability in Visual Studio. I think, and there's work between ConsenSys and Azure as well. Do you guys want to talk a little bit about what Microsoft is doing or how far that's gone?
I think Microsoft is one of the really great partners we have. They're really supportive of the whole industry. So as I said, they built it into Visual Studio, so it's much easier. They built it on Azure, where you have block apps as one of the, you can run this with one click, you can deploy it. Mm-hmm. These are all already interesting aspects. As Christian mentioned already, we work as well now across the industry on identity products, because I think that's one of the very big problems which is not solved yet. So where we work now with block apps and on our side with Uport, and how do we actually fix this for enterprises as well as for end users? Because key management, everything we heard today, once you lose your key, it's great that your data is encrypted everywhere and you have the control. If you lose your key, you have a problem. Mm-hmm. And I think that's the same thing for every interaction with a blockchain or a smart contract. When you lose your key and you can recover it, then that's certainly a problem. Or if it's compromised. And that's something where it's a fundamental challenge for them.
You have a slightly different view on Microsoft, right?
Yeah, I have a slightly more cynical view on Microsoft in that I think that most of what they have done is just a marketing scheme. I mean, if you run a cloud service if you're a cloud service provider or an IaaS provider, typically you will you will get various open source projects to have their start scripts and have one-click deployments of Postgres SQL or go through the various open source projects. And much of what most of what Microsoft has made noise about has been really nothing more than they were already doing with existing technology to begin with. And I think that one of the things that's most exciting is this area around identity, because let's be frank, Microsoft has a massive market share around Active Directory, and if you can hook Active Directory up with keys and then you have an identity solution that will work in enterprises, that is a massive value add, and that actually would make Azure defensible vis-a-vis Cisco or AWS or any of the other cloud providers that are around.
So I mean, the new Microsoft is more open to open source technologies, or at least more collaborative with them. What's the end game for them? They're trying to make it easier for people to run Azure side by side with these, or what's your view on this? Either of you.
Well, I mean, the reality is you can run any of these in cloud. I mean, it's not completely different. You can run Bitcoin nodes in the cloud. It doesn't require, I mean, the cloud is an efficient way to distribute computing power, and you can use it in many, many ways. I think what's interesting here is that as I said, as Casey said, what's interesting is the maturity of the industry evolving, and we're moving away from just thinking through. We are thinking through the tools. We're thinking through the deployment of the tools, and we started to think through applications. And we started to think through applications in a much broader way than just end user application or consumer application, because there is a lot of things that are very helpful on the back end on actually building software, on managing keys, on building, how do you build efficient software? And so the market of distributed application is much broader than either the enterprise app or the end consumer game. I think it's broader in the sense of how do you build software more broadly, and how do you leverage that capability? So, the good example of that was it's very easy to do stamping on Bitcoin. And that's generally, it's an interesting use case. It's hard to do it at scale on the Bitcoin blockchain, but as a use case of something that's very useful from a developer's perspective, it's a great use case of the type of play around having those tools inside normal applications and leveraging that. So smart contract, you can have that within your application for certain transactions where you need that certainty of transaction. So not applying it for everything, but applying it at the right space.
What about IBM? Now they have a project called Hyperledger. Cisco might be involved. Does one of you guys want to have a crack at explaining what IBM's presence in? You're smiling. Why don't you take it?
That's an interesting one. I attended a few of the first sessions. It's interesting because obviously IBM brought in their code, Digital Asset Holding brought in their code, Cisco now contributed, and my impression was they started very fast on an architecture and merging code base, and haven't really thought about what is actually the requirements, what they try to solve. I think they're getting better. They started now requirements group, working where like use cases groups to actually define what the target will be. Yep. It is kind of like, obviously, with the power of the names behind this, it's an important thing. I'm not sure yet which direction it will take. It is clearly for internal blockchains.
What is the end game supposed to be? What are the code bases that they're merging, or how is that supposed to be beneficial?
I don't think they're going to be able to merge the donated code bases. They're just going to have to pick one. But I think what they're trying to do, from what I understand publicly at least, is that they're trying to have basically a kernel of a blockchain client that then can provide various flexibility and used in a variety of contexts.
But I think also what is interesting, I mean, it's it's important that those big names get involved. It's important that Microsoft get involved. I think it's very important as well that we get startups involved. And I think I want to push that ahead. Is like we know a lot of innovation in software came from startups and wasn't developed within large companies. And so it's very important as well that we get more and more developers building their own companies, building their own software, playing around with these tools for their own sake. And trying to innovate and innovate on software, innovate on business models. So the DAO is an example of that. And the more we'll see that kind of innovation, I think the best it is for the industry.
Can I just add on this? I think they have a lot of other parties involved which have not maybe contributed yet, but I think R3, ConsenSys, and others are part of this. And the idea is really, they are very open, at least from the conversations, to get actually the community to help building it. It needs to be removed a little bit from IBM is running this. It should be an open source project. That's why I think Vitalik presented a few weeks ago Ethereum, and they were open, or they are open and interested to include like the capability to run an EVM on this. How exactly it will be implemented and how it will look like, I don't know, but it's, I think, at least a very open discussion about this. Yeah.
And what is sure there is the deeper you go in the stack, the more, by default, this will be open source. So, because that's how you guarantee crypto effectively is having open source software. So the deeper in the stack, the more open source, the higher in the stack, the more you can start proprietary software. The more you build proprietary applications or proprietary layers or proprietary developments. But deep in the stack, it will be open source. I mean, that's my conviction. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, I think it was mentioned this earlier this morning. Standardization is something which is relevant. It doesn't need to be that it's one blockchain. I don't believe this. I think it will be many different solutions. The question is, how can they interoperate? Because otherwise we end up in having like another, I don't know, 20 different solutions out there, and we have different silos than today. So the big question, and I know there's a lot of work on this, how can we make sure that you can actually interact between different chains or different solutions?
I don't think that's a big problem myself, but I think it's a solvable problem quite easily. But one of the things that I think that is going to be very interesting is what happens when we stop talking about the protocol layer. In the last 2.5 years of blockchains, basically every meetup that you go to is going to debate the vagaries of various consensus algorithms, of which maybe 10 people on Earth have any capability of actually knowing what they are talking about. And once we stop talking about the protocol layers and start actually talking about what does this mean to build software collaboratively in a networked environment? What does it mean when we start to open source our processes and procedures that determine the relationships amongst various actors? That is going to be where I think the real innovation is going to start to accelerate. I don't think that we've even begun to see the acceleration of the real innovation here, because we've spent a lot of time down in the weeds with a lot of incompetent people trying to pretend that they're competent, talking about peer-to-peer protocols. So,
just maybe to add on this, I think it's absolutely right, and I think it's an interesting thing that now if you see like the DAO or something else, which is a framework today, once this is like, now it's an experiment, there will be improvements, and there will be a blueprint how you can set up a governance tool on a blockchain. Whether it's an internal one, whether it's an external one, whether you want to start your company and IPO on a blockchain at some point, we don't need to reinvent it anymore, because that's, I think, the beauty with this new smart contract. If we have a standard where you have smart contracts which are out there and people have evolved it, you can reuse them. So it's a lot of, like what we do in ConsenSys, is a lot of platform things. So, I don't know, music platform, other things where if you build this once, you can actually reuse it for many different use cases. So a market app is a market app, yeah, so the smart contract itself can be used for, I don't know, prediction market as well as a sport bets or something else. And that's where it's super powerful, so I fully agree.
And I think the application you see, one of the key differences, they are amazing for opt-in. It's a very different way to opt-in a centralized application than to opt-in the decentralized application. Because you become an integrated actor, you have trust around the processes being run. And so I think that's where I would like to see more and more thinking going in terms of how do we make those trusted opt-in platforms, which are genuinely different from trusting a name, a convention, a company, and those things.
So I just had one last question. So we've talked about some of these proofs of concept. We spent quite a bit of time talking about the consortium and the banking industry. There are some other ones, of course. The Business Week story talks about shipping, transmitting data from ships that are underway. There's an example with John Hancock Insurance, so that's very internal. It's to do with employee gift cards for HR and so forth. But you said a few minutes ago, Yann, it's important to get startups involved here. Is your view as a VC, and maybe yours as well, to close out, is the bet that these startups that are active here would be acquired by the companies in industry themselves or by the technology vendors? What's the most likely scenario?
No, I think the ideal startup I would like to see is a startup where I see decentralized application in that technology stack. And then everything else doesn't talk so much about decentralized application, talks about business process, talks about users, how they behave, talks about the business model, but just have that layer, and that layer allows all the other side, but is not explicitly made important. It's the same way as you say, I'm doing it on mobile, I'm doing it on cloud, I'm doing it using decentralized application software because I want to do this and this, which solve that point. And closing.
I think what's interesting now is that we have now the opportunity to get actually funding from our clients potentially. So the fact that you can, instead of only go to a VC, that you have a startup and you say, like, I want to get my clients being part shareholders. So the fact that a lot of crowd sale, whether like about like, I don't know, legal constraints and so on, like, but let's say in the principle itself that you are able to give something out and you get funding for this, and all of the people who give you funding are actually, I don't know, benefiting from this. So they get part of the shares. So if that's figured out on like what's the legal framework and then around this, I think it's a super powerful thing because it's not anymore that only investors are there in the early stages. It can be anyone, and they can support this, they can use it, and they can actually market it. And I think that's a very powerful thing for startups.
And I think we're out of time on that note, but let's give a big thanks to the panelists here today.